Hi everyone, welcome to another video and thank you so much for visiting my channel. My name is Natasha, I'm a polyglot fluent in 9 languages, and in today's video I'm not going to be talking about languages. Instead, I'm going to be talking about a trip that I just had, one of the best trips in my life. And that was Mexico. And even though this has nothing to do with languages, it still is a little bit related to language learning because, as some of you might know, I speak Spanish and I always keep repeating that Spanish is my favorite language ever. So in today's video, I want to talk a little bit about my trip to Mexico. I'm also going to share some photos and videos from Mexico with you. And I also want to talk a little bit about my experience of speaking Spanish in Mexico with Mexicans. So I think that I do have some subscribers here from Mexico. I don't know which part are you from, so let me know in the comments if you're Mexican and where exactly you're from. And also those of you who are not Mexican, in a case you visited Mexico, please feel free to share your experience of visiting this beautiful country with me and with the rest of my subscribers. And let's start this story about Mexico. So I love to travel. I would say that I have traveled more than average person of my age. I have visited quite a few countries. However, this was my first ever trip to Mexico. I have been living in the US for the past 2 years, and I have a feeling that almost everyone I met here in the US has been to Mexico, which is understandable. It's neighbor country and a lot of people go there for holidays. However, I have never visited Mexico till recently. And it is weird because it was always my dream to visit Mexico. It was one of those destinations that I really dreamed about visiting ever since I was probably born, but I would say precisely ever since I started watching Mexican telenovelas at home when I was a kid. So I'm Eastern European. I'm coming from Bosnia, and in my country, back in the day when I was a kid, those, we call them Mexican telenovelas, but they actually come from anywhere in South America, I guess. However, I think they're mostly from Mexico. Those things were so popular among everyone, mostly among women. I would say that most of the viewers were women. So in my case, those were my mom and my grandma. However, I feel that a whole generation of people in Eastern Europe, and especially in the Balkans, grew up watching Latin American telenovelas. That's why, in a case you are a Spanish speaker and you visit Eastern Europe or Balkans in this case, you are very likely to meet a lot of people who are able to understand basic Spanish, or I have a feeling that every single person from that part of the world knows at least 10, 20, maybe even more words in Spanish. And that's all because we actually basically grew up with those telenovelas. Now, I know that everyone is probably rolling their eyes now because telenovelas are considered stupid. And I have to admit that sometimes those, like acting and the whole story that's going on in a telenovela is stupid, makes no sense, doesn't have much logic. However, I feel that this is the first step towards learning a language. And in my case, those stupid TV shows really did help me learn Spanish. However, it's not enough to just watch telenovela in order to be able to learn Spanish. You have to invest much more time and much more work into that. However, those were my first step towards learning Spanish, and that's how I fell in love with Spanish. And I think that's how many people of my generation from Eastern Europe actually fell in love with Spanish. And also, I think we also learned something about culture of different Latin American countries. So even though I do admit that telenovelas are very stupid, I still think that they're pretty useful when it comes to learning languages. So this was the reason why I always dreamed about visiting Mexico. I also know that Mexico has much more to offer than just telenovelas. I used to read a lot about Mexico, about Mexico's history, about different parts that are recommended for tourists to visit. So when I decided to travel there with my husband a few weeks ago, I was over the moon. It was also my birthday trip because I recently had a birthday. I'm not gonna say how old I am because that's really depressing. But this whole trip to Mexico was my dream come true in a way. So I have visited one touristy resort place in Mexico that was beautiful. However, it's not that interesting because I feel that those touristy resort places look exactly the same in every country in the world. And if you don't get out of a resort, which I didn't, you wouldn't even know where you are, because they look exactly the same in Asia, in South America, in Central America, even in Europe. The only difference is maybe climate, but all those touristy resort places look exactly the same. So every time I meet someone who has only traveled to one country and stayed only in resort, I feel like that person didn't even really get to know the country, and I wouldn't even count it as traveling. But I have also visited Mexico City, which immediately goes to my top 3 favorite cities in the world. And this is surprising because it's hard to make me really fall in love with a new spot, because I already have few favorite spots in the world, and I didn't expect that much from Mexico City, or actually I did not expect to be so impressed with Mexico City. However, I was. The thing that surprised me the most was how big it is, and this is probably a minus in my opinion, because on one hand I love big cities. I could never live in a small town. I'm really not, I don't have a mentality to live in a small town, and also I would get bored really fast. So I love big cities. However, there is a certain point where city really becomes too big. And I believe that Mexico City has reached that point long time ago. If I have someone here among my subscribers who lives in Mexico City, I really need you to explain me how you do it. I mean, how do you survive your days? Because that traffic and the amount of people on the streets is crazy. The biggest city I have been to, or I have spent some time living in, was Istanbul. I was there for a few months, 6 or 7 years ago, and it was crazy. It's a beautiful town. However, just moving throughout the town is very hard. You practically waste most of your life just being in the car and trying to get from one point to the other. And I have learned that Mexico is even bigger than Istanbul, much bigger. So I really want to know, how do you people who live in such big cities, what do you do? Do you just stick to your part of town and you don't really go out of that part of town? Or do you really waste or use most of your life to just get from one place to the other? Because it's beyond my understanding how can life in such a big city even function. However, living in such a huge city definitely has its advantages, and in my opinion, the advantage number 1 was food. Mexico City has so many places where you can eat, and obviously it's much cheaper than the US, much cheaper than a lot of places in Europe as well. And also what I was surprised with was the amount of little street food places pretty much everywhere. I feel that almost every street I have walked through had at least 1 or 2 little stands where a lady or a guy was making some local, I say local, but some Mexican traditional street food things. I have tried one place twice. It was somewhere, I cannot remember the name of the street. However, it was a lady that's supposed to be pretty popular, I guess, among people who are into street food. And she was selling quesadillas and other Mexican things. And I have tried quesadilla with mushrooms and cheese because I don't eat meat. However, I believe that for people who eat meat, that would be like the best place in Mexico City, one of the best places to try street food. And I really loved it because where I'm from, or where I grew up, street food is not that big of a thing. There are a lot of little bakeries where you can buy something. However, I didn't used to see a lot of people there selling where I'm from. I didn't used to see a lot of people selling food on the street because our cuisine is also not really a type of cuisine that you would eat when you're standing on the street. And also here in the US, I don't see that much of that. I see some like trucks with Mexican food. However, not just a little tiny little stand where someone is preparing food and selling it. So this was definitely a big surprise for me. I do like Mexican food. However, I'm pretty limited when it comes to enjoying it because I don't eat meat, and I feel that most of Mexican dishes do have some type of meat, or even if they don't, they use some kind of lard or oil that's made from animals. So I was expecting to not be able to eat almost anything. However, I was surprised how vegetarian and even vegan friendly a lot of places in Mexico City are, which I guess is a consequence of being such a huge city and offering something for everyone. So food was definitely something that I really enjoyed. However, I have been in Mexico City for 5 days, and when I first came, I was expecting to never get bored of Mexican food. I thought that I would be eating Mexican food every single day, and when it's time to leave, I would still be hungry for more. However, it didn't happen. I did enjoy it almost every day, but by the end of my trip, I was like, okay, I think I'm not gonna eat Mexican food for a while. I just had enough of it, and I feel that this is something that happens to everyone who travels to a country that has different cuisine than their own or than the one they're used to. You feel like it's so amazing and you will be enjoying a lot of it, and then after a couple days or a few days, you're just like, okay, I think I'm ready to go back to like my normal eating schedule or my normal eating routine. And now the most important thing, language. So I speak Spanish. It was together with English, first foreign language that I have started to learn. I was super young when I started. I think I was 8 or 9 years old. I never had a course, or I never had a language teacher. I never learned it in school. So I basically taught myself everything. I was learning Spanish thanks to internet and different books. And I already had a lot of opportunities to practice Spanish with different people all around the world where I have traveled. I somehow always come across people who are native Spanish speakers. So traveling to Mexico and speaking Spanish with locals was not my first time doing this, but I was surprised how good it went. I have to say that I have already visited Argentina and Chile before, and Spain, but long time ago. And when I was in Chile, I did have a little bit of hard time understanding what are people saying. So I want native Spanish speakers who are following me to tell me if it's just me problem, or do people from Chile really speak a little different than other Spanish speakers? Because Argentinians also sound different. They have their own type of Spanish, but I didn't have hard time understanding them. However, with people from Chile, it's a beautiful country. However, I did struggle a little bit just understanding them, which did not happen with Mexicans, and I think this is because I grew up watching Mexican novelas and not ones from Chile. So I was surprised by how smooth it went. I was using Spanish pretty much everywhere, and I didn't have hard time understanding them at all. And I also hope they didn't have hard time understanding me. So this was probably the best part of my trip. Every time I travel somewhere and I'm able to speak with people in their native language or the language of the country I'm in, I always feel super good, and in a way I feel sorry for people who are not able to speak any language. I think that kind of deprives you of really enjoying your traveling experience. Another thing I have to say about Mexico City and Mexico in general, I don't think I have ever met so many nice people in any other country that I have visited. Of course, when you're in a touristy place, people are going to be nice to you because you're a tourist and you're bringing money and all that. However, I have not met any unfriendly person, not even a person who is just like average, not friendly, not unfriendly. All Mexicans that I have met there were super nice. Even people in like a little street food stand or a little coffee shop that probably didn't even know that I was tourist at first, they were so friendly. They were smiling, and just I had a feeling that they're not faking being nice to people, they're just genuinely nice people. I know that this is something that's, I guess, known about Mexicans, but I have heard it before. However, I really will keep Mexico as my country number one when it comes to people friendliness. So I can't wait to go back there. I'm sure I'm gonna visit Mexico City again. And I'm also sure, or I want to visit other places in Mexico too. So I have to say I have not been so impressed with a country in a long time as I'm impressed with Mexico. Now, please let me know how many Mexican subscribers I have here and what part of Mexico are you from. Also, if you're not Mexican, have you visited Mexico? Do you plan to visit Mexico? Is it even one of the countries you would like to visit or not? Thank you so much for watching this video. We are gonna see each other next week, and next week I promise I will start talking about languages and language learning again instead of just talking about my trips. So thank you so much for watching this video, and see you next week.